Welcome to the Great Basin Fire Potential Outlook for October 2016 through January 2017. This is Gina McGuire. Over the next several minutes, we'll talk about the recent weather conditions, along with current drought conditions and the current state of our fuels, changes to our global pattern, and then our expectations for the weather pattern as we move from October through January, and then looking at our fire potential. First, we'll look at our recent weather. In September, our precipitation, the departure from average, is the map on the left, and this shows well above normal precipitation throughout September for much of the eastern half of the Great Basin, with the exception of far southern Nevada into parts of the Arizona Strip, and then also western and northwest Nevada, along with parts of the central Idaho mountains, remained on the drier side. If we look at the overall percent of average over this last year for the entire water year, we can see most of the Great Basin has at least seen near to above normal precipitation, with the exception of a small part of Utah into western Nevada and parts of Idaho, which were just below normal. Now if we look at the current state of our drought conditions across the Great Basin, with this additional moisture we've seen over the last month and really over the last year in some areas, our drought conditions continue to improve over the eastern half of the Great Basin, with either no drought in some areas or only abnormally dry conditions. We still have severe drought over western Nevada and then extreme to exceptional drought into parts of the Sierra, but this is still a vast improvement from what we've been seeing over the last 6 months. If we look at our drought outlook through the end of the year, we see the drought will generally persist over the western portion of the basin, but again will remain generally with no drought or abnormally dry conditions over the eastern half of the area. Now we'll look at the current state of our fuel conditions. With this additional moisture, our 100-hour fuel moisture and all fuel moisture has been increasing, especially over the eastern half of the Great Basin, and is now above the 11th to 15th percentile across most of the eastern half of the area. We still are seeing some lower fuel moisture, especially over parts of western and northwest Nevada, but even these fuel moistures are generally above 5%, which is really the critical value across the Great Basin. If we now look at our ERCs through late September, we can see by the green lines on these maps, those are the current conditions. The gray line indicates average, and the red line indicates the maximum ERC over the last 10 years. We can now see over much of Idaho into northern Utah, ERCs have dropped to below normal several times really over the last couple of weeks. Looking further south in our drier areas of western Nevada, ERCs are still above normal, but are still shy of our maximum values. We will see these ERCs decrease as we see some cooler and wetter weather as we move through the month of October. Also over southwest Utah, our ERCs did increase somewhat in September, but have since dropped significantly with the increase in recent moisture and cooler temperatures. Now if we look at our live fuel moisture data, first focusing up in the north, live fuel moistures have increased over the northern half of the Great Basin and are generally near or slightly below normal. Looking further south, we have seen a little bit more modest increases in our live fuel moisture over parts of Nevada and into southern Utah, but still these fuel moistures are only near or just below normal. The main question as we start to go into the fall and into the winter months is what will be the transition of ENSO when we see a return of La Nina or will conditions stay neutral, and this will affect the weather pattern that we do see over the western U.S. Now if we look at an animation of sea surface temperatures in the equatorial Pacific, we'll first focus at the animation on the top portion of the image. This shows current sea surface temperatures over the last couple of months. Our main area of focus is off the South American coast, where we can see generally this cooler trend of waters over the last few months. Now if we look at the bottom animation, this shows the anomaly into how far above or below these sea surface temperatures are in relation to normal. As we can see, we did see some cooling early on in the animation, showing the sea surface temperatures dropping to below normal. However, now they have kind of moderated and are almost near normal, really representing our neutral conditions that we're seeing in our ENSO region. Now that we've seen the current sea surface temperatures, and we've seen the transition from El Nino earlier this year to now neutral conditions in the equatorial Pacific, we'll look further ahead at some model information telling us where we're going from here. As we can see from this image, these are all different model solutions here in the different colors with the circles and squares down in the map. As you can see, they're all below the zero line, indicating these cooler ocean temperatures will likely continue over the next several months. Really only until we start getting into the early part of next year does some of these lines start to increase more in the positive direction, but still in this neutral category between -0.5 and positive 0.5. So we'll likely see more of a neutral scenario with the ENSO as we move through the winter months. So what does this mean after we put all of this together? Where do we go from here as we go through the winter? Now we start looking at the expected weather pattern as we go from October through January. These images in the middle and bottom row show expected temperatures in the middle row and expected precipitation patterns in the lower level from October through January. In October, we can see generally a warmer and drier regime, especially over the western portion of the Great Basin, so we'll likely see a little bit drier conditions over there. Therefore, we could see brief increases in fire potential for a burning period on windy days, but still the prolonged cooler nights will still help minimize those conditions and allow fuel moistures to gradually increase. Now, as we move through November and December, we start to see a wetter pattern potentially emerging for the northern half of the Great Basin. We also may see some slightly cooler temperatures up north, but still warmer temperatures for the southern portion of the area. So we likely will see wetter conditions emerge in November and December, but again, we'll be watching those temperatures, as if they stay warmer, that would increase snow levels. So we may not see snow in the lower elevations. It would be mainly confined to maybe the higher elevations. As we move into January, we still see this warmer pattern for the southern tier of the country, and potentially still some wet weather over the northern and eastern areas of the Great Basin, with potentially some drying in the far south. So we will be watching these conditions as we move through the winter very carefully, as the amount of snowfall we get certainly will have an impact on our fuel conditions. So now, putting all the pieces together, as we are expecting these wetter conditions and cooler temperatures to eventually emerge, we will continue to see normal fire potential through the winter months, again with the exception of possibly in October on the western side of the basin, and really only for a burning period on windy days after abnormally dry conditions. Now we'll look at our national fire potential outlook, and you can see most areas are transitioning to normal over the next few months. October is the image on the top, and you can see generally above normal fire potential, really only confined to California and then areas out east, and then that same threat continues through parts of November into December. However, again, much of the West is returning to that normal state of fire potential, which is generally low fire potential this time of year. So in summary, we've seen drier conditions continue over far western areas with still some drought conditions. However, further east, due to increases in moisture recently and over the last 6 to 12 months, we have seen those drought conditions improve. Sea surface temperatures have cooled, transitioning us from El Nino to the neutral condition, which will likely continue through the fall and into the winter. Therefore, fuel moistures will continue to increase as we see a little bit more moisture move into the Great Basin, and then the fuels will transition to dormancy. Therefore, low or normal fire potential is expected through the winter. That concludes our briefing for today. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us. Thank you for listening.